when I first did Star Wars, I did it as a big piece. It was like a big script. It was way too big to make into a movie. So I took the first third of it, which was basically the first act, and I turned that into what was the original Star Wars. In the process of rewriting that script and thinking of it as only a movie and not the whole, trilogy, I decided that Ben Kenobi really didn't serve any useful function after the point he fights with Darth Vader. Although in that draft, he continued on through the air battle at the end, and then he continued on through the whole script, the other two stories. And but when I took one and I looked at it, I said, he just stands around for the last 25% of the film, watching this air battle go on. And he really has no real function, and it would probably be much more satisfying, powerful, and interesting if Darth Vader were to kill him, or he were to go into a different form. I made that decision based on just working on Star Wars. After Star Wars was successful, and I said, well, gee, I could finish this entire script. I could do the other two parts. I came to certain realizations about things that were in the script that were more difficult to now translate. Another one was the Wookiee. In the end of the film, it takes place on a Wookiee planet, and there's a big battle with the Empire and the Wookiees and that sort of thing. Since I couldn't do that, I took one of the Wookiees and made him a co-pilot with Harrison. But in the original concept, the Wookiees were a primitive tribe, and that was sort of key to what was going on at the end of the film. And then when I put Chewbacca in as a co-pilot, I've kind of established them as a fairly sophisticated race. And so then when I went back, I couldn't use the Wookiees, so I turned them into Ewoks. So in the case of Ben Kenobi, I had Luke being trained by Ben, only I had killed Ben off. So now I had to come up with another Jedi who was older and wiser and shorter than Ben to train Luke. And that's how that was the beginning premise of Yoda.
Welcome, Masters and Padawans, to episode 569 of Full of Sith. It's me, Brian Young, a host of the show, and with me as ever is the redoubtable Holly Fry. Holly, how you doing?
I'm good. I've decided that just means you can doubt me twice. I'll redoubt you.
That's not what that word means at all. Words have meaning, Holly.
But somebody made them all up, so language evolves.
That word has never evolved that way.
But it is today.
Oh, man. That's not...
Brian doubts me twice.
Sure. Whatever. If that's the way today is going to be.
Sure. I mean, in the interest of, jolliness and just being silly, sure. Today, that's what that is.
Okay, fine. Well, first off, I just want to wish everybody happy holidays. There's a whole stretch of holidays this season right now as you're listening to this, and this is probably close to our last... No, we've got one more episode of our 11th year of podcasting.
Wild.
I think. Yeah, wild, as Full of Sith. But this is our penultimate episode of 2024.
And in 2025, we're changing the name of the show to the Neilcast, and all we're going to talk about is that little blue charmer.
Oh, man. Episode 4 was so good.
Oh, it was very stressful, but I'm glad that he has a cute French parkour girlfriend now, sort of.
Yeah. She's on a different planet. You probably don't know her.
Right? 100%.
Yeah. So... when we talked about topics for this episode, I had this idea for an episode, and I think it'll be a lot of fun. But this stretch of the year feels a lot like Star Wars time, just because for a good 5 or 6 years there, we had a good stretch of Star Wars movies that all came out in December. And right now, this stretch of time is the 5th anniversary of Rise of Skywalker, the 7th anniversary of The Last Jedi, and the 9th anniversary, if you can believe it, of The Force Awakens.
I can't believe it. Like, I'm a shade older than you. I know I always harp on this, but like the idea that we would be having a conversation, that there's so much Star Wars and that we have new Star Wars coming every week and that we are marking the anniversaries of the 3rd set of trilogies. It's wild.
Yeah, so I figured we'd talk a little bit about the sequel trilogy, as we're kind of, I think the 5th anniversary of Rise of Skywalker is one of those, the 5th anniversary is one of those you talk about, but the sequel trilogy in general, kind of looking back at those releases, and I want to talk about the myth. There's this, one of the common complaints I hear about Star Wars in general, but about the sequel trilogy specifically, is this idea that I'll hear people throw it around, and intelligent people who know a lot about Star Wars and know a lot about filmmaking will go, I just wish they had a plan for that trilogy. It would have been so much better if they had a plan.
Yeah, that is the common complaint. I have a whole theory, but keep going.
And I would just like to break down the myth of the plans of the other trilogies and the myth of the lack of plan of this trilogy. But I want to do that after we talk about, just sort of this time of the year for these movies, and sort of like how we feel about Force Awakens and Last Jedi and Rise of Skywalker after that time has passed. I do think time has been kind to them. I do think time will get kinder to them. We've had, it's been 25 years since Phantom Menace. This is the 25th anniversary of Phantom Menace, which makes me feel older than anything.
Hush you.
Well, I mean, also that it's the, this is the 44th anniversary of Empire Strikes Back. But no, I mean, like, Empire Strikes Back, I don't remember that coming out, right? Like, Phantom Menace is the one that, and Return of the Jedi, I was literally 2 years old when it came out and I saw it first. Even though it's my first memory, it doesn't stick in there as like a waypoint in time. It's just like, oh, time began. But Phantom Menace, there was like, I was there and I have vivid memories and I have vivid memories of thoughts and my ideas and what I was doing and how I was doing it. And celebration was there. And so that 25 years passing is bizarre to me. But Force Awakens in that 9 years seems even more bizarre because the show's been going longer than that. And I've been doing Star Wars journalism longer than that. And I've been writing longer than that. You know what I mean? Like, it's just like there are things that have a continuity in my life that have been stretching longer than these movies have been around. And now all of a sudden we're coming up on, we're a couple of weeks out of the 10th anniversary of The Force Awakens.
Yeah. We're all time traveling. It's just we're stuck in forward.
Yes, it's true. But I think time is going to be even kinder to these movies, to be honest. And I
do too.
I think that what we saw happen with the prequels is going to happen with these movies.
Oh, 100%.
I kind of feel like we're in that era right now for these sequel movies where there's still a really loud sort of minority that are just like, every time you mention them online, I think they have like keywords set up that alert them when someone mentions it.
Right.
That allow them to go in and say, oh, why would you bring up that movie? Where they have the same like 5 complaints they saw in a YouTube video that they plug in as a comment.
Uh-huh.
And that's sort of the level of discourse that you get. And that's something that I put up with a lot during the years of the prequels.
Oh yeah.
Um,
Same.
Every time I would mention Jar Jar as something I liked, I would sort of have to buckle up and prepare for like, I'll be honest, like I kind of really liked arguing about stuff like that because it would be like, I would feel like, okay, I'm going to push back against this. I'm going to state my opinion like it's the majority, because I think it is, that overwhelmingly people do like the prequels, and I think time has borne that out. And I'm not going to let these people, like, I'm going to make them explain to me why they think they're bad, and their arguments usually sort of fall apart. And I did that for a long time online with the prequels and Jar Jar and whatever else. And I try not to do that as much anymore with the sequels, just because it's exhausting and I don't have the same energy I did as a younger man. But the pattern is exactly the same.
Yeah. I mean, I have obviously a slightly different version because since I do have a couple years on you, I had like a weird thing happen with the prequels where every time I said I liked them, it was not only they suck, they suck, they suck. It was also like I was somehow a traitor to the original trilogy. And it's like, no, you can like both, it's fine. I don't know how that's factoring into, especially kids that have grown up with the sequels. But I will say this, for anybody that doubts, every time I am in Galaxy's Edge, there are little kids dressed as Rey and Kylo and super excited to see those characters. And like there is a whole generation of kids that imprinted on that trilogy, just the same way like my age group did on the original one, and as we've said before, a younger generation did on the prequels. So I think it's inevitable that it will be much beloved, and as those kids age up, we've talked about before, they will be able to articulate the depths of their love and the reasonings for it the same way all of us have as we've grown up with our whatever Star Wars was where our heart was first captured.
I think there's something oddly countercultural about this trilogy too, where it's disgustingly prescient.
Oh yeah.
In this cultural moment that we're in, where it's like, no, everything's good, we're fine, we fixed everything, and then all of a sudden, like, somehow Palpatine returns.
Uh-huh.
You know what I mean? And
yes.
So you've got this resistance of people going like, I don't know, like, we're all just tired, we're all just like, we thought we fixed this, right? We had our victory, and now it's all going down the tubes again, and they destroyed, Hosnian Prime. What are we supposed to do now?
Yeah.
And I think that the last time this happened, I think that's one of the things that really sped up the acceptance of the prequels. Was people looking around going like, wait, maybe George Lucas was onto something. You mean like big business and government was bad?
Yeah.
And George Lucas was trying to tell us that? And then they watch Phantom Menace and go, maybe we should have been paying attention to the taxation of trade routes to outlying star systems. That wasn't actually so weird. We used to make fun of that, but actually maybe important.
Mm-hmm.
And I see a lot of people taking inspiration from the Resistance and the exasperation that Leia has, where she's just like, fine, I'm gonna fight this on my own if you people in the government aren't going to do it on my own. Or on your own. If you're not going to make the changes that you're going to, we're just going to have to fight ourselves.
Yeah.
And so I think those movies are going to have an outsized impact on influencing people in really good ways, and people are gonna latch onto them and treat them with the reverence that people treat the other movies with too.
I hope.
I don't see why they wouldn't.
Yeah, me either. I mean, the only thing I can think of is that, we have reached this weird, I feel like lately it's tipping back the other way, thank goodness, but we've reached this weird time in our global culture where grousing is a job for some people. Like they actually make money at it. So that's the one thing that I'm like, ooh, that always gives me pause, but not to be a Debbie Downer, an unbeliever.
Yeah, but I mean, there's just as many voices that there's just as many voices that say like, hey, look at this, and connect that to things going on in the real world. And I think that there's just as many who do that are positive voices that aren't monetizing it. Yes, that there are people who listen to those folks and that are severely misinformed because of those folks. Because I think a lot of those grousers are straight up lying to people.
Oh,
right?
yeah.
But like Lando says, there are more of us, Poe.
Lando. I was just thinking about Lando earlier.
Yeah, what about?
Oh, I was rewatching Solo while I was in my sewing room.
Yeah, that movie's fun. That movie's 6 years old this
I
year.
know. Oh, and
I wish we got more of that. I really
me
wish we got
too. I feel very cheated of more of Alden Ehrenreich as Han.
Yeah.
I just think he's spectacular.
I still hope we can get more of that also. Like, that's the thing. Like, there's not anything that Lucasfilm has given us over the last 9 years that I wouldn't want more of. Right?
Yeah, I mean, even the stuff that I'm not into, I love watching other people get excited because they feel like they finally connect to something in a very particular way. And like, I just want more of that for everybody.
Yeah. I mean, like, there's, of all the stuff they put on the big screen and all the live action TV and all the animation, like in the straight canon timeline stuff that they've put, I mean, like, what would you be like? Nah, I wouldn't. Like, we had, the sequel trilogy, which, it seems like they're still trying to develop stuff with Rey. And if rumors are true that maybe that's the stuff Simon Kinberg's working on, it seems like they've got a few different projects they're trying to juggle with Rey and sort of putting her as a linchpin in things. We've got Solo that they're building stuff, or that they should be building stuff with. Maybe Lando's still happening, maybe Lando's not. I want more Solo.
I want more of all of it.
Yeah.
I want more Scissor Punch.
Yeah.
I want more of all of it.
Andor, definitely.
Yes.
Cassian with Rogue One. We've got that coming in April, which is not that far away.
Oh, it's really not.
We've got as far as the sequels go, Rian Johnson is still sort of signed on for his trilogy, and I'm sure he's going to have to run out his Knives Out contract before he's able to even think about really diving into that.
Yeah, that's one of those things I would love to mention in that, and I know you know this as well, so I'm just, reiterating it for anybody that doesn't know. Every once in a while, I see people do the thing of like, yeah, that's never going to happen. And the thing is, from the get-go, he was pretty open, like, it's a ways off. It's, like a decade off before I get to that, which we're not at yet. You know what I mean? So I don't, there's always been that the very long tail plan for it has always been pretty openly discussed. So it's not like, I just feel like people are always like, oh, another harbinger of doom. That's never going to happen. And it's like, we're not even to the time it's supposed to yet. So I'm not sure what you're thinking.
So this is something that I kind of explain to people a lot. And there's far more evidence for the fact that Rian Johnson's still doing his trilogy and literally zero evidence that he's not. All of the evidence that says he's not comes from those YouTube sort of grifters that make stuff up, right? All of the evidence for starts with the fact that they announced that they signed a contract, and Kathleen Kennedy got up on stage at a Star Wars celebration and said that working with Rian Johnson was one of the best experiences she's ever had. She's never seen anyone who moves a camera like he does, except for Steven Spielberg.
Right.
When I went out to that, there was like a summit of influencers at Lucasfilm in the leading up to Last Jedi, and the licensors that they had talked to us talked about, and the folks in the licensing department talked about how Rian Johnson was literally like the best partner they could ever ask for.
Yeah, he's the dream.
Yeah, because the movie was done like 6 months early. He was consistent in his vision. Stuff wasn't changing all the time. And they could like plan on stuff. They could plan on designs for toys. They could plan on they had the porgs ready to go. You know what I mean? Like all the porg plushes. He had backstory locked in and loaded, and he was a team player as far as like, here's my idea of what the backstory is, so that like Claudia Gray could write Bloodline to come out before the movie,
right,
from his notes
and flow together.
Yeah, like he's absolutely a dream for a big machine like Lucasfilm to work with. And like he's got a good working relationship with them. It worked perfectly for all of the moving parts. It made a gazillion dollars. It's a terrific movie. It was a critical darling. From all accounts, from all like legitimate accounts, it's a well-received movie, well-liked by the audience. It's just a really loud minority segment of the audience that's like, we don't like it, and a bunch of YouTube grifters that don't like it. They announced that they signed him. They put a press release up on the website, and you'll notice every time they announce a press release that like, hey, we signed these guys to write it or do something with it, and it goes up on the website. As soon as they say, hey, that's not happening, they pull that release off the website. Guess who's is still up on the website? Right. Rian Johnson's. Every time somebody catches Rian Johnson in an interview or on the red carpet and asks about it, he says, there's a lot of people who will say things, but like it would be news to me if I'm not doing it, and I would really hate for that not to happen. But as far as I know, still going. Yeah. So like, yeah, there's literally less than zero evidence that it's not happening.
Which is fine by me, because I cannot wait for more.
And even a lot of the people who were like, yeah, he's a good director, but I didn't like that movie.
I don't understand, but go with God.
A lot of them would say like, but I'd like to see what he does outside of everything. Like this trilogy that he said he was doing was outside of all the confines of anything else we've seen in Star Wars. So even some of those complainers that didn't like Last Jedi but think Rian Johnson's really talented, they're part of the audience for this. You know what I mean? Like, yeah. And there was that recent call too, that one of the Disney executives sort of commented on the cancellation of The Acolyte, and they said the complaints about the racial makeup of the cast and the grifters and stuff had zero to do with the decision, and it was 100% the budget versus the audience.
Yeah. I mean, that kind of brings into play like the thing that we all often talk about, and I feel like is my soapbox of like, people write a lot of corporate fan fiction in their heads about what's going on and how it's playing out, and like it's very different, and it's usually much less interesting. Like the numbers of financials to audience are not very thrilling to consider compared to the potential drama of fan outrage caused this. It's like, that's not how it works. I mean, I
Yeah.
think if they could come up with a pared down version of that show that could be made at a lower budget, there would
Yep.
probably be more discussion to be had.
Yep.
And I
I
hope
think
there
that's
is.
probably right. But yeah, so Rian Johnson's back. I think The Last Jedi, I made no secret that I think The Last Jedi is probably, like, I think it's definitely the best of all of the movies that Lucasfilm has put out in the Disney distribution era. And I think
that's tight with Rogue One for me.
it is tight, but The Last Jedi, it's hard, right? Because, like, The Last Jedi and Rogue One are both top tier. There's no two ways about it. Rogue One is definitely amazing, and I would definitely put it as like second or tied for first. You know what I mean?
Mm.
But Rian Johnson's mastery of writing and cinematic language pushes my buttons a little bit more than the mix of Tony Gilroy and Gareth Edwards. And I imagine that if Tony Gilroy had made Rogue One on his own without having to sort of patch over Gareth Edwards' work, I might feel differently about Rogue One and it might have surpassed.
I mean, I will say, right, some of mine is an inherent bias because, as we know, like the Force stuff, the Jedi stuff is not the most interesting part of Star Wars to me. Like, it's cool and I don't dislike it. I'm not dissing it in any way, but like for me, I've always been more into the gritty, scrappy, boots on the ground people that are just trying to like put a resistance together. So Rogue One was like, hello, ma'am. We've served up that thing of your dreams. It's right here on a silver platter. Would you like to enjoy it? Yes, again and again.
And for me, my favorite thing was always Return of the Jedi and the story of the Jedi and Luke. And I don't think Force Awakens actually continued the story of Return of the Jedi and Luke Skywalker. I think The Last Jedi is the first one that actually started fulfilling the promise of continuing that story and those themes and Luke's struggle and his family lineage and what the Force was and how the Jedi were supposed to continue. And it was the only one of those three movies that really continued the classic trilogy in that way without sort of rehashing it, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And offered me something new with Star Wars in a way that was beautiful and shocking and still maintained the rhyming sensibilities that George Lucas built with them, but also dared to do something new and amazing and did it in a way that was so elegantly written that, like, I don't know, when people tell me like, oh, that movie was so poorly written, I want to teach like a 6-hour class breaking down that movie scene by scene to explain to them. Like, I hate the phrase like you're objectively wrong, but like on the score of The Last Jedi, I literally could teach a 6-hour class breaking it down scene by scene, element by element, how like everything plays to theme, how each of the characters' stories interconnect with the other, how everyone has structurally this like triangle of influence around them pressing down on them, and how their decisions impact the story going forward. Like, it's just like, it's so well written, it's disgusting. And I don't know if it's because like you need to be a writer to like get it or something. I don't know. Like, I don't know. I don't want to say that because I don't know.
I will say this, and I doubt this will mitigate your chagrin or irritation when you encounter that. I think a lot of the time, like, we know, obviously we talked about it in this episode many times, there are people that make their money by complaining about things. And in our universe, because it's what we're into, that's Star Wars. But there are also, we often run into people that we, like and respect and are friends with, and they will sometimes say things like what we started out with, talking about that, there was no plan or whatever, or this didn't make sense, or this has a plot hole, whatever they want to say. And I do think there's a different dynamic that's going on in some cases, where there are people who just, for whatever reason, whether it's that they wanted it to recapture what it was to be, 6 or 7 years old and seeing Star Wars for the first time, which cannot happen, and they didn't get that, and so they were chagrined, or they just didn't connect with it at the degree they wanted to, but they had really wanted to. It's almost like, instead of saying, like, hey, maybe every piece of Star Wars isn't for me, which is painful. I don't think, by the way, any of this is really going on at a conscious level. But instead of saying, like, oh, I, who love Star Wars and have, perhaps made it, if not my whole personality, a solid 3/4, that is not a judgment on my part. Lord knows I'm way up there. I think it's easier for them to come up with reasons that the content was bad, instead of just saying, I don't connect with this galaxy that I love deeply anymore, or in the same way that I used to. Like, that's a hard thing, right? And I understand it. And I think subconsciously that's part of what's going on.
So it's the old adage, like, you can never convince someone of something if their job depends on them not understanding it.
Kind of, yeah, but it's on a personal psychological level.
Yeah. So, like, them saying it's bad writing is them externalize something that they're incapable of taking responsibility for.
Kind of. It really ties to that whole idea of, like, real Star Wars versus not real Star Wars that people have come up with in their heads, which, like, it's all real, none of it's imaginary, we were all there for it. But you know what I mean? It's like they can delineate, no, these ones I still connect to, so those must be the real ones, the good ones. And these ones, this piece I don't connect to, so it's wrong, and I'm going to figure out why. And it's like, it doesn't have to be wrong for you to not connect to it. It just isn't what you connect to. Like, there are a lot of different people in the world, and we all connect to different things. Like, just as much as somebody doesn't like Last Jedi, there are people like us that just are deeply in love with it. And I think it's more of a defense mechanism, because they don't, it hurts. It's, it's like, when you're friends with somebody and they grow in a way that doesn't really include you anymore, or doesn't appeal to you anymore, and you mourn that friendship. And I think this is kind of happening to some people with Star Wars, where they don't have that inherent joy from it, from some of the new stuff, in the way that they did the old stuff. Again, some of this is aging. And so it's easier to say that's bad than to say I don't have the same feelings about Star Wars as I used to, or everything in the Star Wars universe isn't made to delight me the way I felt like it used to be.
And it probably didn't help that Luke Skywalker was probably their idol, and they could not.
That's exactly it. My self-insert did something I couldn't bear thinking of him doing. That's bad. And it's like, no. It's painful maybe, but that's not the same thing as it being a bad story.
Yeah. And I just love Luke's journey in that.
I do too.
and I relate to it so hard. Like, I just see it so hard, where it's like you watch people make the worst decisions and or not even the worst decisions, but like decisions that they think are right but aren't. And I don't know, like, I think it's so much more interesting than Luke being a cartoon superhero.
Agreed.
For that whole time.
Agreed.
And it's the most plausible explanation for the question that J.J. Abrams set up at the end of Force Awakens.
Yeah, I agree 100%. It's just a lot more interesting. If Rey had gotten to that island, she's on Octo, and she holds out his lightsaber, and he's like, right on, sister, let's go. And they just go kill people in the First Order.
Yeah.
That's not a very dynamic story.
No, it's not. And it raises the question, like, why didn't Luke go help Han?
Right.
Like, what happened? Where's the falling out between Luke and Han?
Yeah.
Why didn't Luke go rescue him? Why didn't Luke intercede between him and Ben? Why didn't Luke go stop the First Order? And Luke, when he asks Rey, what do you expect? Like, I'm going to go out and face the entire First Order by myself? Like, J.J. Abrams wanted to put the galaxy in a state that simulated the putting the Resistance on their back foot in a galaxy the same way the Rebels were in A New Hope.
Yeah.
And you can't do that if Luke Skywalker is omnipotent and running around with a lightsaber able to take down any threat.
Yeah, it's not very interesting. And it's just cutscenes from a video game. And while I love video games, that's not a very compelling movie.
Yeah. So this kind of brings us to the idea that, like, a lot of people were like, well, that those movies would have been a lot better with a plan.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to point people to the idea that there was a plan for these movies, and they followed it pretty well. There were definitely some wrenches thrown into that plan, but George Lucas, back before he sold to Disney, knew that there was going to be more Star Wars movies. He knew that there was going to be Luke going into exile. He knew that there was going to be a new Force user. Her name was Kira at that point, I believe, and that was the Rey character.
Mm-hmm.
Coming into the fold here. And she was going to be some sort of scavenger. There was going to be this philosophical look at the Force that we got about what it means to be a Jedi, and Luke's philosophical journey there was going to be largely the same. He was going to be this grumpy sort of version of Luke turning his back on these things. That plan was there from the beginning.
Yeah.
That plan was there before Lucasfilm sold to Disney. If you don't believe me, you can go look into the art of The Force Awakens and the art of The Last Jedi. And you can see that these parts of the plan were there. Obviously, J.J. Abrams and Lawrence Kasdan and all the other writers and Rian Johnson sort of were able to iterate on those things. But for the most part, like, they changed things, yes, to create a realistic blueprint moving forward, to carry things forward. But they were sticking to a plan that was carrying forward what George Lucas had done. They didn't totally throw out everything he did. I know George Lucas had that comment that they threw out a lot of what he did. But George Lucas, we'll get into that in a second.
Okay.
But I would like people to note that Rian Johnson and J.J. Abrams were working hand in glove to the point where The Last Jedi was written before The Force Awakens was finished. J.J. Abrams was a producer on The Last Jedi.
Mm-hmm.
J.J. Abrams was quoted in the press before The Last Jedi even went to film, commenting that the script was so good and that he was angry he didn't get to direct it, and that J.J. Abrams actually even made changes to The Force Awakens to adapt to what Rian Johnson was doing, including J.J. Abrams' script for The Force Awakens put R2-D2 on or put BB-8 on Octu instead of R2-D2 with Rey.
Right.
And it was Rian Johnson in the script that demanded that it switch, because R2 needed to be there to have that connection to Luke, and BB-8 was Poe's droid, so it made sense for BB-8 to stick with Poe. So, like, the idea that they didn't have a plan and that they weren't working together and that they were in these isolated silos is simply not the case.
Yeah. To follow on that, one of my least favorite things that I hear people say is like, yes, Rise of Skywalker was bad, and it's because of the mess that Rian Johnson left J.J. Abrams. And it's like, boo, are you not paying attention to the timeline? They all worked on this stuff together.
So
I don't understand.
Rise of Skywalker was going to be difficult for whoever stepped into it, period.
Amen.
Now, the folks who were working on what was going to be episode 9, the guy who did Jurassic World, whose name is escaping me right now, he was working hand in glove with Rian Johnson and the story team and even Imagineers. Remember, Kylo Ren's ship in Galaxy's Edge was something that was, like they were working with those filmmakers and stuff to create that moment between, like the Imagineers were working with the filmmakers on both sides of that to have that story tie between the two movies.
Right.
And it got a little bit muddled when it wasn't that they wanted to throw out his script. It's that Carrie Fisher died. And the plan originally was that Harrison Ford was going to carry The Force Awakens, Mark Hamill was going to carry The Last Jedi, and Carrie Fisher was going to carry Episode 9. And that was the plan. There was a plan in place, and that's how these filmmakers were going to do it.
Yeah.
And Carrie Fisher passed away. And when you spend 2 years wrapping your head around Carrie Fisher's going to lead this movie, and here's my script, and this is how I want to do it, and here's how I've been developing it, and all of a sudden she's not there, and you have no idea how you're going to do it, I don't blame him for not being able to continue.
Yeah, me either.
Yeah.
It's so huge. And I mean, we all know as fans what that felt like. And I know that it was a cajillion times harder. That's a number today. A cajillion times harder for anyone that was working with her emotionally. But then to add on top of that, like, you're grieving a lost friend and colleague. And then you also are like, and I have to figure out how to make this work for my job. Like, that's a lot. And I wouldn't blame anybody for being like, I don't think this is doable for me.
Yeah. So J.J. Abrams, like, there's literally only two people you could ask to step in. J.J. Abrams or Rian Johnson. They're the only two directors that are that entrenched with the understanding of the sequel trilogy and what's available, right? Mm-hmm. To be able to step in. Personally, I would have preferred if Rian Johnson had, but J.J. Abrams or Rian Johnson are literally the only two people on Earth that could step in that quickly to come up with something.
Yeah.
And Abrams is the one who did it. I feel like Rian Johnson was probably too far into Knives Out to be able to.
I would imagine, yes.
In my head, there's an alternate timeline where Rian Johnson did it, and we ended up with a better Episode 9. But J.J. Abrams had an impossible task to sum up the 9-episode Skywalker saga with the jigsaw puzzle of remaining footage of Carrie Fisher from Episode 7 and 8 in a movie she was supposed to carry with scraps of footage. Like, that was an impossible task. So yes, they had a plan, but that plan got torpedoed as soon as she passed away. Like, no plan survives contact with the enemy. In this case, the enemy was the Grim Reaper, right? Like, there was no way that plan could have survived. But Rian Johnson and J.J. Abrams followed the plan for Star Wars Episode 7 and 8. And those two films interlock quite beautifully, actually. And Episode 9 pays them off in a really, really elegant way. But the other thing I want to, the first thing is that there was no plan for the sequel trilogy is a complete and utter myth. The idea that one director needs to shepherd that plan is also a myth, right?
It's also sort of ignorant of the way the film industry works today versus how it used to work.
Yeah.
Especially that Lucasfilm, it's a very different thing when one person has created something and can helm all of it versus the way most movies are, where it's like, who is available that understands this material, that wants to do this, that we trust with this. And it's unrealistic to expect any director or writer to be like, yes, I absolutely have time to do nothing but this for the next X number of years. It's just not how the industry works, because it's a moving vehicle where things shift and change, and promised projects fall apart or resurface when people don't expect. Like, it's just very hard for unless you're like a James Cameron, who, similar to George Lucas, can be like, I'm all in on this, only my own projects. I have all the money and all of the resources I need. I can just go at my own pace. Very few people can do that.
Yeah. And George Lucas, there's a lot of, I don't know if you've ever seen interviews with Francis Ford Coppola where he actually gets really angry about Star Wars, where he talks about how Star Wars robbed us
of the other George Lucas films.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Star Wars robbed us of one of the greatest filmmakers of all time, because George Lucas spent 30 years on Star Wars, essentially. And I can't say as I blame him for feeling that way, because Francis Ford Coppola was his mentor and saw what he was truly capable of, and he changed the world with it. But there's still, you look at THX 1138 and American Graffiti, and you look at some of the stuff he pulled out of his head that he was producing, whether that was Indiana Jones or Kagemusha or Mishima, A Life in Four Chapters, or Willow, or all the other stuff that he was putting together as a producer, or just throwing money at, whether that was new animation techniques or Pixar. I don't think George Lucas gets enough credit for Pixar. Just as a filmmaker, Star Wars did rob us of George Lucas as a director for things other than Star Wars. But George Lucas did hire other directors to do that stuff because of the pressures that it takes to make a Star Wars movie.
Yeah.
There's a lot of moving parts, and he needs people to work other parts of those moving parts. So he came on as the executive producer and ran it like it was a TV show, which is why Irvin Kershner and Richard Marquand took over parts of Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi. But George Lucas didn't have this grand master plan for the original trilogy that people seem to think he had. If you read J.W. Rinsler's making of Star Wars Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi, you'll look at the early versions of those stories, look at the early versions of the scripts, look at the early versions and how they were iterated into the stories we eventually got. There was no plan.
Well, and what there was planned shifted dramatically.
Yeah, they were flying by the seat of their pants, and that's creative limitation breeds innovation. Creative limitation breeds better stories. Those time limits that they were working in under, those constraints, were breeding innovation of technology, of storytelling, of story. Those are what made Star Wars Star Wars. Those are what made the leaps in technological achievement. Those are what created some of the best moments in story. I think it's a mistake to say, you just need to give them more time. I love the art of filmmaking, but it is also a business of filmmaking, and you cannot responsibly spend as much money as you do without coming up with something that under, without being on a specific budget with a specific time frame. And if you look, do the same thing with the prequels, right? Like George Lucas was tweaking things up to the last minute. There was that article recently about how originally there was a thought that Ewan McGregor was going to be Qui-Gon, right? And Qui-Gon was going to be Obi-Wan. And he was going to take Obi-Wan's name at the end of the movie, and that was going to be the big switcheroo. Or there were moments where Anakin was going to be much older, and there was this decision that happened late, like early drafts of the screenplay, where that Anakin was much older to start with, or that Anakin was much older in Attack of the Clones, and that it was going to be this love triangle kind of situation. And that Padme and Obi-Wan were going to be involved as well, and that's what was going to help turn Anakin. The details, like George Lucas is really great at broad strokes, but the details are what are always completely unplanned until the last minute. Go look at all the deleted scenes in Revenge of the Sith. Yes. How many times did they redo the beginning of that movie because George Lucas had no idea how to make it exactly right? He iterated and iterated and iterated until he had it right, because he didn't have the right plan. He just knew what was right when he saw it. Star Wars movies in these huge trilogies don't have the plan that people are complaining that the sequel trilogy needed, because that's not how movies like this at this scale actually work.
Yeah.
It's a myth.
It is. It is. It's corporate fanfic. It's
Sorry.
like I understand why people fall into it, right? It ties to the same stuff I was talking about before. We all love this stuff so much, and we want to like delve in and know as much as we can and be encyclopedic, and I obviously 100% understand that. But at the same time, like, people have to recognize that there are just parts of it we will never know. It's kind of like the way you can never know what the dynamics of a marriage or a relationship are unless you're one of the two people in it. You can't ever really know all of the various wheels that have turned in the process of getting a film from its initial idea and its first draft to on the screen, unless you're actually part of it. And even if you're part of it, you probably don't know the whole story unless you are way high up the food chain.
Yeah.
And those people are not giving interviews that tell all of the changes that got made, because nobody wants to do that.
I mean, I think the closest that we could get is like those Rinsler books.
Agreed. But like, it's not like Kathy Kennedy is ever going to give an interview and be like, well, we ran into this whole problem, and then, there were like 27 drafts of this, and then we argued in a room for a little while about the best way to go forward, and then we all decided this is what we should do, but something else didn't work out. Like, they're never going to get that granular with all of the shifts and changes that happen, because one, there's no time.
That's kind of what I love about the Rinsler books, though. They get into that in Return of the Jedi, right?
Oh, yeah. But I mean, in terms of what we're getting today, we may get a book about it in the future.
Oh, yeah.
But, like, it's not like on the day-to-day we're getting updates from anybody on what happened. And so people piece together, I guess I want to say they're using, like, an Occam's razor approach and saying, like, this is the most likely thing. But even that is not always going to be accurate. And also, people aren't always doing that. They're often a little more fanciful.
Yeah, no, I think the closest that we can get are the art of books. Mm-hmm. And in the art of books, you can read between the lines a lot, because they do a lot of first-person interviews with folks who were working on it. And you do get those like, well, this is an idea George had, like those sorts of things where you can go like, oh, so you mean this concept was from George? Or, Pablo will be quoted saying like, this came from one of George's earliest ideas before we sold to Disney, like things like that, where it's like, wait a second, like this was part of the original plan. And it was like all of these concepts of Luke as the grumpy old man, things
right.
like that.
Right.
Where it's like, okay, you get this sense that like this was part of the plan. And I get it that not everybody has time to pore over those books like I have and like a lot of others have, but they're good reads, right? Like Phil Shostak and Kristen Baver and Amy Radcliffe and J.W. Rinsler, who have put together those books, for the most part, have done an amazing job getting those stories out of the artists and out of the filmmakers and out of everybody that they interviewed to do that. And the making of books seem to have... Oh, the other ones are Paul Duncan and the Star Wars archives.
Oh, yeah,
right?
yeah.
Like he dove deep into those for a different publisher. And he got to go through all the archival stuff, and those tell an even different side of it. And I guess that's why it's frustrating that the work of these people who are writing this corporate fanfic gets traveled so far and wide, and I guarantee they haven't read one 16th of this stuff, and they don't know how the process works. They don't know what goes into all of these things. They don't know half of who these people are, and so they'll just say they needed a plan, as though they're this armchair executive producer, as though Kathleen Kennedy was like, let's just start, right?
Right.
Let's just start without a plan. Let's go. It is shocking to me how many projects they talk about being in development at Lucasfilm, and it's shocking to me how many we probably haven't even heard of, right?
Oh, yeah.
And that's all them just making plans for stuff that may or may not happen. And to say that they didn't have a plan for these is to just go, I don't know what I'm talking about.
Right.
And it's also to say, I don't actually know what the plan is or how they work, because I don't know how Star Wars movies have traditionally worked.
Right.
Because George Lucas, the plans changed a lot, right? Go back to drafts of Return of the Jedi where it's Had Abaddon and they're fighting underneath the Jedi Temple on Coruscant, and that's Palpatine's lair, and there's lava down there, and Return of the Jedi ends with the Force ghosts of Obi-Wan and Yoda coming and helping, basically the end of Rise of Skywalker.
Right.
Coming and helping defeat Palpatine. Because that was an early draft. Or if you go back and look at, people are like, Lee Brackett doesn't get enough credit for her work on Empire Strikes Back. Go read Lee Brackett's draft of Empire Strikes Back. She gets plenty of credit and maybe too much. Her draft of Empire is nonsense. Because I've read all these different drafts. I've read as much of these drafts as you can get to, right? I love reading different drafts of screenplays at different points of their iteration. I've read the early drafts of the Star Wars and how it got from basically a rehash of Hidden Fortress to what we got now.
Right.
One of my favorites to do it with actually is David Goyer and Alex Proyas's versions of Dark City.
Oh, yes.
Reading how it started and how we got to the masterpiece that we got to is so fascinating. But I'm that kind of nerd who loves to see how a piece of art like a film gets from the writer's initial idea and the initial first draft of the screenplay to what we ended up with on the screen, and what considerations there were for why things changed. And it doesn't matter how good your plan is. George Lucas said, and I've heard Dave Filoni reiterate this, that the biggest problem with moving from animation to live action is that it's not how good you can tell a story, it's how good you can tell a story on the day.
Right.
And no matter how great your plan is, if you can't get the right performance, if you can't get the things that you need on the day. You can't just Stanley Kubrick it and go through 900 takes. Go back and watch the beginning. When was the last time you watched the beginning?
Oh, it's been a minute for me.
There's this wonderful scene where they've got the two kids they've got Jake Lloyd and the other kid who was up for Anakin. It was the two kids that were like, these are the last two.
Right. One of these kids will be Anakin.
Yeah. And George was explaining to Rick and Callum why Jake Lloyd was going to be Anakin, even though like the performance, like he kept flubbing lines and stuff, but Jake Lloyd just kept going, and you could see like the performance in his eyes.
Yeah.
And he was like, that kid's going to cost me more money in editing, but he's going to give me he's less polished, but he's going to give me something genuine in every take.
Yeah.
The other kid is memorized, but it's going to come off as fake. The other kid is going to act like a kid.
Right. He's very prepared.
Yeah.
But he's very prepared.
Yeah. And he's like, there's not going to be any variation there. The other kid's going to give me way more options in editing.
Yeah.
And it's like, that movie I would bet that there's 10 different versions of Phantom Menace with Jake Lloyd doing it 10 different ways.
Oh,
Probably
yeah.
100 different ways.
Oh, yeah.
And all of the planning in the world and everything in the script that George Lucas put doesn't matter except for what he captured of Jake Lloyd on the day.
Yeah.
Plan doesn't matter.
The other thing that I would say is the very obvious evidence of there has to be a plan. Do people think all of those costumes, props, and droids just sprout up instantaneously? Like, that stuff is planned so far in advance because you need to ramp up production on all of that.
Yeah. Well, and especially too, like with the way they're doing visual effects now, especially starting from Solo forward, the visual effects have to kind of be locked in some ways, especially with the volume, but especially with the way they're doing the ships now.
Yeah.
They have to be locked in before the film starts shooting.
Yeah.
So
which
like,
is so cool.
Yeah.
Like I am very in awe of the way that has evolved just in the time that I have been alive, but especially in like the last 10 years, how much filmmaking has changed because of technology like that.
Oh.
It's astonishing.
I love the way they had to do like the final battle in Rogue One. Like, I got to do this. So they had us out for the press junket and they brought us to ILM. And so they actually, what they did is they choreographed, they built the entire final space battle in real space, right? So you could watch the entire thing from like a 30,000 foot view, and it would play out in exact choreography in real time of the movie, like how everything played out. And basically you had like a Wii U controller pad, right?
Mm-hmm.
And basically you went in and sort of filmed. You went on like a soundstage and you got to pick the shots,
right,
in this virtual space, and pick the shots that were the most dynamic, or you could follow them around or whatever. And so Gareth Edwards could go in and actually pick the shots that way. And then they could just render out the shots that he was picking out of this Wii U thing. And like, you can't tell the story. Like you can't go in and like film that. I'm using air quotes, unless the story of how all that's done is planned in advance and they build it and they render it like in at least a rudimentary way so that he could pick the shots,
yeah,
and have all that storyboarded. And I got to like they let the journalists who were there like go in and play with it for like 10 or 15 minutes each, and it was just the most amazing feeling getting to go in and like do cinematography just like that
Right.
close. But like you can't do that if you're not planning things. Yeah. There's a plan for everything. Like I don't know. Just I feel like half of what we say on the show is just like, don't give in to the misinformation. They know what they're doing. They know what they're doing.
Well, it's like I don't know if it's that people can't appreciate how much filmmaking, particularly at this scale, is a combination of planning and preparedness and retaining the fluidity to move with what happens on the day, and sometimes even in other ways, right? Like we all know about, all of the storms in Tunisia. We know about all of these things, but it's like you recognize that changes stuff, right?
Yeah.
And I guess it's just maybe difficult to synthesize those two things as being two sides of the same coin, right? That you have to both be very prepared and very agile, and know that your plan isn't always going to work.
That was one of the most fun things, actually, listening to Rick McCallum. If folks want to go back and listen to that interview with Rick McCallum, like listen to him talk about how like dealing with the storm in Tunisia was easier than dealing with not knowing, literally not having a plan for how to do Jar Jar. He's like, the storm was easy. Like, that's just like, I called up the Tunisian army and was like, hey, could you guys help us out? And we were shooting that day. We just found places that weren't messed up by the set. I futzed around with the schedule and we were shooting that day. No big deal. But Jar Jar, that was the thing that was giving me the headaches because we just didn't know how to do it. And, you pick brilliant people and they're working on stuff, but like there was a genuine like concern that we weren't gonna be ready because no one had done it before and we didn't know how, and etc. And it was like that was the thing that gave them the heartache because they legitimately didn't have a plan for that.
Yeah.
But storm, no big deal. They just call the army.
Help. Yeah. Filmmaking. Complex.
Yeah. But no, the next time somebody's like, I wish they had a plan for the sequel trilogy, you can tell them they did. As much as they had a plan for any of the other Star Wars movies. All of the Star Wars movies were pretty equally planned. All of the other Star Wars trilogies were just as planned as any of the others. And then sigh heavily.
Yeah.
So, where can people find you, Holly?
Oh, in the sewing room. I know that joke is so old. I'm sorry. I apologize. Anyway, I am on Instagram as Surly Girly 5, and I'm on Blue Sky as myself, Holly Fry. If you want to listen to me yap some more, can't imagine why, but you can do that at Stuff You Missed in History Class and on Criminalia. And again, Killer Cocktails is out now. You can buy it and make drinks, both from the show and original to the book. What are you doing, Brian?
You can find me across all social media at Swankmotron, mainly Blue Sky these days. You can also find me at my website at swankmotron.com, and that's where you can pre-order signed copies of my next book coming out next month called Battletech Voidbreaker. As you are listening to this, you can also get free short stories from me for the holiday as a gift from Catalyst Games, a free Battletech Christmas short story and a free Shadowrun Christmas short story. They were both a lot of fun. Just go to the Catalyst Game Labs website and you can download those. And then as far as Full of Sith goes, you can go to fullofsith.com and download the entire back catalog of episodes dating back almost 12 full years, longer than the sequel trilogy has existed. And you can send us your emails at holocron@fullofsith.com. We'd love to read your emails on the show every week. So send us an email. We could read yours next week. So, and be kind enough to rate and review the show wherever it is you listen to it. So unless you think there's anything else, Holly.
Just that whatever holidays anyone is celebrating, I hope they are beautiful and full of joy and peaceful and restorative, and that we all go into 2025 supporting each other and finding joy for one another and being kind to one another.
Yes, be kind. Above all else, be kind. So, with that said, for super producer Mike Pilot and for Holly Fry, I'm Brian Young, and the Force will be with you always.
Sir, if you'll not be needing me, I'll close down for a while.